The champagne glass in Bradford Ellery Sterling's hand stopped halfway to his lips when the ballroom doors opened and everyone turned to look, not at the string quartet, not at the ice sculpture melting slowly under the chandeliers, at the woman in the wheelchair being told, in front 400 of the city's wealthiest people, that she no longer belonged at the head of the table she had built with her own 2 hands. Isaiah Reeves stood 12 feet away holding a tray of untouched hors d'oeuvres, close enough to hear every word, close enough to see the exact moment Eleanor Vance's composure cracked, and close enough that when he finally set the tray down and spoke 4 words into that frozen silence, his voice would end a career that had taken him 7 years to rebuild, and begin something else entirely, something none of the men in that room could have predicted from a banquet server in a rented tuxedo. Before any of that happened, before the accusations and the recording and the 4 words that would be repeated in boardrooms for months afterward, there was just a father getting his daughter ready for a night neither of them expected to remember. Isaiah Reeves woke at 5 every morning, whether he needed to or not. 7 years of habit had carved the time into his body the way a river carves a canyon. Slow and permanent. He made coffee first, always black, always in the same chip mug that said world's okayest cook, a gift from his daughter 2 Father's Days ago when she still thought that joke was the funniest thing in the world. Then he woke Maya. Maya Reeves was 7 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, and convinced that she would one day be a marine biologist, an astronaut, or possibly both at the same time, depending on the day. She had her mother's eyes, dark and quick, and always asking questions, and her father's stubborn jaw, the kind that did not know how to back down once it had decided something mattered. Isaiah had raised her alone since she was 2, since a car accident on a rain-slicked overpass took her mother, Renee, in the time it takes to blink. He did not talk about that morning much, not because it did not hurt anymore, but because something stopped being wounds and start being weight, something you carry so long it becomes part of how you stand. He worked banquet service for Prestige Event Staffing, one of 3 agencies that supplied the city's hotels and private clubs with servers, bartenders, and set up crews for galas, weddings, and the kind of fundraisers where a single centerpiece cost more than his monthly rent. It was not the career he had imagined for himself back when he was studying business administration at a community college he never finished, back before Renee died, and every plan he had ever made rearranged itself around a toddler who needed him more than any degree ever would. He was good at the work. Better than good. He remembered names. He noticed when a guest's water glass sat empty for more than 90 seconds. He could carry a tray of champagne flutes through a crowd of 600 without a single one tipping, a skill that earned him more compliments from event managers than he could count, and exactly 0 raises. The agency paid the same rate to men who could not walk in a straight line without dropping a fork. Money was tight in a particular way that is tight for people who work hard and still fall behind. Maya's school had a reading program that cost $40 a semester, and Isaiah had learned to treat $40 the way other men treated $400. He clipped coupons. He drove an extra 15 minutes to the store where gas was 6 cents cheaper. He said no to things so that he could say yes to the things that mattered, and Maya, without ever being told exactly why, had grown into a child who understood the difference between wanting and needing better than most adults. What almost nobody knew, not the agency, not the other servers he worked beside 3 or 4 nights a week, was that Isaiah had once been 2 semesters from finishing that business degree, with a professor who told him he had the sharpest red on a balance sheet she had seen in 15 years of teaching. He kept a single folder of old coursework in the bottom drawer of his dresser, not because he ever expected to use again, but because throwing away felt like agreeing with the world that it had never mattered. He also kept something else quiet. Every month, without exception, he set aside $30 for a scholarship fund at the community college that had once let a broke single father attend classes between shifts. It was not much. It would not change anyone's life on its own. But he remembered exactly what it felt like to be one small kindness away from giving up entirely, and he had decided a long time ago that if he ever had $30 to spare, somebody else was going to get the same chance he almost lost. That Friday started like any other. Isaiah picked Maya up from school, made her a grilled cheese sandwich cut into triangles because she said squares were for people with no imagination, and sat with her at the kitchen table while she read aloud from a library book about octopuses. Then his phone rang. Prestige event staffing needed a lead server for a gala that night, a last-minute request after another employee called in sick. Double pay. The catch was his usual babysitter, an older woman 2 doors down, had a family emergency and could not take Maya. He almost said no. He had said no to plenty of shifts over the years rather than leave his daughter without someone trustworthy to watch her. But double pay meant new shoes for Maya before the weather turned, and the event manager, a woman named Priya, who had always treated him fairly, promised there would be a quiet staff room where a well-behaved kid could do homework and watch a hotel-provided tablet without anyone minding. Maya was thrilled. She had never been inside a hotel ballroom before, and the idea of watching her father work somewhere fancy, even from a back room, felt like an adventure. She packed her own backpack with 3 books, a coloring set, and her stuffed octopus named Professor Tentacles, and told her father with complete seriousness that she would be, quote, extremely quiet and professional. Isaiah's own father, Walter Reeves, had died 6 years earlier, and the two of them had spent 31 years understanding each other mostly through the language of work rather than words. Walter had pushed a mop bucket down hospital corridors for 3 decades, had come home most nights smelling of antiseptic and exhaustion, and had never once, in all that time, complained within earshot of his son about the particular indignities that came with being an older black man in a uniform that made half the people he passed assume he had nothing worth saying. What Walter had given Isaiah instead of complaints was a single, quiet philosophy, repeated often enough over the years that it had become something closer to scripture than advice. You don't have to be loud to be right. Walter used to say, usually while fixing something around the house that did not strictly need fixing, just needed attention. You only have to still be standing there when everybody else finally figures out you were right the whole time. Isaiah had carried that sentence with him through every difficult year since, through Renee's funeral, through the sleepless first months of learning to be both parents to a toddler who did not yet understand why her mother's side of the bed had gone permanently cold, through every shift he worked exhausted because there was no version of the math that let him work less. He had never expected the sentence to matter in a hotel ballroom, full of people who would never know his father's name. But some lessons are built exactly so they can travel that far. Maya had inherited more of her grandfather's patience than she probably realized, though she expressed it in ways that were entirely her own. She cataloged the world the way some children catalog toys, carefully out loud, with running commentary that Isaiah had learned to treat as its own kind of music. On the drive to the Grand Whitmore that evening, she had spent the better part of 20 minutes explaining to her father, in exhaustive detail, the precise mechanism by which an octopus could taste with its skin, pausing only to ask whether hotel ballrooms had ceilings tall enough for someone to do a cartwheel, a question Isaiah answered honestly, which was that he did not know, and had never once, in 7 years of working events like this, thought to look up long enough to check. That was the truth of Isaiah's working life, in a single, small exchange. He moved through rooms built for other people's celebrations with his attention fixed entirely on the details that made those celebrations run smoothly. The empty glass, the unlit candle, the guests whose expression suggested they needed something before they had to ask for it. And he had trained himself, out of necessity as much as professionalism, never to look up at the ceilings, never to imagine himself as anything other than useful and invisible in those spaces. It was a skill that had kept him employed for 7 years. It was also, though he would not have phrased it this way at the time, a skill that had quietly convinced him that rooms like the Grand Whitmore's main ballroom were not places where his own voice was ever meant to be heard, only places where he made sure other people's voices carried smoothly to their intended audience. That belief would not survive the night ahead of him, though he had no way of knowing that yet. Sitting in the parking garage with Maya still narrating the octopus's 29,000 skin receptors, check his tie in the rear-view mirror, and telling himself, the way he told himself before every shift, that all he needed to do tonight was stay quiet, stay useful, and get his daughter home before her bedtime slipped too far past reasonable. The Grand Whitmore Hotel occupied an entire city block downtown, the kind of building whose lobby made people lower their voices without being told to. Tonight, it was hosting the Vance Foundation Gala, an annual fundraiser for pediatric medical research that had, over the past decade, become one of the most important nights on the city's social calendar. Isaiah had worked it twice before. He knew the drill, the ballroom layout, the kitchen choke points where servers collided if they were not careful. What he did not know yet was who Eleanor Vance actually was, beyond the name printed at the top of every seating chart, and the portrait hanging near the entrance of a striking woman in her 40s with silver-streaked dark hair, and eyes that looked like they had already seen every trick a room full of powerful people could try to pull. Eleanor Vance had built Vance Analytics from a rented office above a dry cleaner into a data infrastructure company valued at just over $3.1 billion. The kind of company that quietly powered half the logistics networks most people never thought about. She had done it in 11 years, through 2 recessions and 1 very public and very painful divorce, and she had done the last 5 of those years from a wheelchair, after a small plane she was piloted herself went down in bad weather over the Adirondacks, and left her with a spinal injury doctors had once told her would keep her out of any boardroom for good. She had proven them wrong the way she proved most people wrong, by simply refusing to stop, and by building a company culture that made accessibility a design principle instead of an afterthought, because she had learned firsthand exactly how many doors in this world were built without people like her in mind. She was, by every account, brilliant and exacting, and occasionally cold in a way that made grown executives nervous, and she had absolutely no patience for people who mistook her chair for a weakness. What almost no one at the gala that night realized was that Eleanor was also exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with her legs. Her board of directors had spent the last 4 months circling her like sharks that had finally smelled something they liked, and tonight, in the ballroom she had personally funded and decorated for a cause she genuinely believed in, several of those sharks intended to make their move. Isaiah's first 2 hours of work passed the way they always did, a blur of trays and names and quiet efficiency. He checked on Maya twice, finding her curled in an overstuffed chair in the small staff lounge just off the kitchen corridor, deeply absorbed in her octopus book, Professor Tentacles propped beside her like a bodyguard. She waved at him each time with the particular delight of a child who has been granted a rare glimpse into her parents' separate adult world. It was during his 3rd pass through the main ballroom, balancing a tray of champagne near the head table, that Isaiah first noticed a tension. Not obvious tension. Nothing a casual observer would clock. But Isaiah had spent 7 years reading rooms for a living, learning which guests needed attention and which needed to be left alone, and something in the air near Eleanor Vance's table had shifted the way weather shifts before a storm nobody has forecast yet. Bradford Sterling sat 2 seats to Eleanor's left. He was 61, silver-templed, built the way men get built when personal trainers are simply another line item on an expense account. He had served on the Vance Analytics board for 9 years, longer than almost anyone besides Eleanor herself, and he wore his tenure like a title he expected people to use. Beside him sat 2 other board members, a woman named Cordelia Marsh and a man named Foster Higgins, both nodding along to whatever Sterling was saying in a low voice, both wearing the careful, blank expressions of people rehearsing something. Isaiah did not know any of this yet. He only knew that the laughter at that table sounded wrong, too sharp at the edges, the kind of laughter people perform rather than feel. He refilled water glasses and moved on, telling himself it was not his business. The same thing every person in that ballroom would tell themselves for the next hour, while something quietly unfair built itself brick by brick in plain sight. At exactly 8:40, the Foundation's board chair stepped to the small podium near the head table to introduce the evening's keynote, a brief presentation on the year's research grants. It was meant to be Eleanor's moment, the culmination of a year of work, and the single largest fundraising night of the Foundation's history. She rolled forward in her chair to take the microphone, and that was when Bradford Sterling stood up. He did not wait for her to finish crossing the small distance to the podium. He stepped in front of her, angling his body just enough to block the microphone stand, and began speaking in the warm, carrying voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. Before Eleanor gives her remarks, he said, I think it's important, out of respect for everyone here tonight, that we address some concerns the board has been asked about regarding Eleanor's fitness to continue leading this company. The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent the way a held breath goes silent, in stages, table by table, as people realized what they were hearing. Eleanor's hands went still on the wheels of her chair. Isaiah, refilling a water glass 6 feet away, froze mid-pour. I want to be clear, Sterling continued, that this comes from a place of care. But there have been questions, medical questions, about Eleanor's capacity to handle the demands of her role. Questions the board has a fiduciary responsibility to address transparently, especially in front of the very donors and stakeholders whose trust we depend on. A woman at a nearby table gasped softly. Cordelia Marsh nodded along, her expression arranged into something that was supposed to look like sympathy and instead looked like satisfaction poorly disguised. Eleanor's voice, when it came, was steady, but Isaiah, close enough now to see her hands, noticed they had curled into fists against the armrest of her chair. This is not the time or the place for this conversation. Bradford, she said, we can discuss board matters in board meetings. Sterling did not sit down. I'm afraid the board felt this needed to happen publicly, he said, because there have been documents circulating, medical assessments, that suggest cognitive concerns alongside the physical ones. I know that's difficult to hear, Eleanor, but the people in this room have a right to know who they're trusting with their donations. There was no such document. Eleanor knew it. Isaiah, standing there with a water pitcher in his hand, did not know it yet. Not for certain, but something in the careful rehearsed cruelty of Sterling's phrasing told him this was not concern. This was a performance, staged in front of 400 witnesses specifically, because a public stage made it harder for Eleanor to fight back without looking defensive, without looking exactly like the unstable, incapable woman Sterling wanted this room to believe she was. Foster Higgins produced a folder from beneath the table, sliding it toward the podium with the theatrical solemnity of a man delivering evidence in a courtroom drama. We have documentation, he said. Independent medical review, commissioned by the board, that raises serious concerns. Eleanor stared at the folder. Then she looked up, and for one unguarded second, Isaiah saw something in her face that had nothing to do with anger. It was closer to exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of someone who spent years proving herself to people who had already decided, long before any evidence existed, exactly what conclusion they intended to reach. That folder is not a medical review commissioned by this board, Eleanor said. It's a review commissioned by you, Bradford, from a physician who has never examined me, based on records you do not have legal access to. Sterling's smile did not move. That's a serious accusation. It's a true one, Eleanor said, and for the first time her voice rose enough to carry to the back tables. You spent 4 months building a case to force me out of the company I built, because Larchmont Capital offered you a board seat on their new logistics venture the moment I'm gone, and you need my removal to collect on that offer. The room shifted again, murmurs rippling outward now, phones beginning to appear from purses and jacket pockets. Sterling's composure cracked for exactly half a second before he recovered it. This is exactly the kind of erratic accusation the board has been concerned about, he said, turning slightly to address the room rather than Eleanor directly. I understand this is emotional for her. I understand these are difficult circumstances. But I would ask everyone here to consider whether a leader who responds to legitimate governance questions with conspiracy theories about a business rival is a leader this foundation should continue to trust with your generosity. It was, Isaiah would think later, one of the more skillful pieces of cruelty he had ever witnessed, because Sterling had found a way to make Eleanor's defense sound like confirmation of the very instability he was accusing her of. The trap had been built with enough care that the only way out of it seemed to be silence, and silence would have looked exactly like guilt. Eleanor looked out at 400 faces, at donors who had trusted her with the foundation's future, at photographers whose cameras had already begun to flash, and Isaiah watched her search the room for something, anything, that might turn this back in her favor, and find nothing. That was the moment Isaiah Reeves set down his tray. He had told himself for the entire preceding 10 minutes that this was not his business, that he was a banquet server in a rented tuxedo with a 7-year-old asleep in a staff lounge down the hall, and that men like Bradford Sterling did not answer to men like him, and that speaking up here, in front of 400 of the wealthiest people in the city, would end with him unemployed by morning at best. But Isaiah's father had spent 30 years as a hospital orderly, a job that had taught Isaiah, long before he understood why it mattered, that the people who moved quietly through the edges of powerful rooms often saw more clearly than the people seated at the center of them. His father used to say that the truth does not care whose name is on the building. It only cares whether someone is willing to say it out loud. Isaiah had also spent the last 4 minutes doing something almost nobody else in that ballroom had done. He had been listening, really listening, to every word Sterling and Higgins said, and something about the folder Higgins had produced had caught his attention in a way he could not initially explain. It was during Sterling's second attempt to steer the room's sympathy, while Eleanor sat in silence searching for a way to answer an accusation designed to have no good answer, that Isaiah remembered exactly why that folder looked familiar, and the memory landed in his chest like a struck match. 2 hours earlier, while setting up the head table, Isaiah had noticed Foster Higgins and a man he did not recognize standing near the service entrance, speaking in low voices. The unfamiliar man had been holding a folder, the same folder now sitting on the podium, and Isaiah had overheard, without meaning to, a single fragment of that conversation. The unfamiliar man had said quietly, "I told you, this needs another doctor's signature before it's worth anything." And Higgins had said, back in a hushed, irritated tone, "We don't have time for another signature. Just make it work for tonight." Isaiah had thought nothing of it at the time. Overheard fragments of business conversations happened constantly at events like this, and it was not his place to interpret them. But standing here now, watching Higgins present that same folder as an independent medical review, the fragment rearranged itself into something he could no longer pretend not to understand. The folder on that podium was incomplete, possibly fabricated, and the man who had been finishing it 2 hours ago in a hallway had said, in Isaiah's own hearing, that it needed another signature before it was worth anything. Isaiah looked at Maya's stuffed octopus sitting in his mind's eye back in that staff lounge, at the version of his daughter who believed, with the complete faith of a 7-year-old, that her father was the bravest man she knew because he had once carried her 3 blocks home the rain, without complaint. He thought about what it would mean to let this happen in front of her, even secondhand, even if she never knew the details, to raise a daughter in a world where he had chosen silence when speaking cost him something. He set the tray down on the nearest service stand. Every server had been trained, on their very first day, that staff do not speak during events unless directly addressed by a guest. Isaiah knew that rule. He knew what breaking it would likely cost him. He walked forward anyway, past 2 tables of stunned donors, until he stood close enough to the podium that his voice would carry without him needing to shout. "That document is incomplete," he said. 400 heads turned. Sterling's expression flickered with something between confusion and contempt, the specific contempt of a powerful man interrupted by someone he had not previously registered as capable of speech in this room. "Excuse me," he said. "I said that document is incomplete," Isaiah repeated, his voice steady despite the roar of his own pulse in his ears. "I heard a man finishing it near the service entrance 2 hours ago. He told Mr. Higgins it needed another doctor's signature before it was worth anything, and Mr. Higgins told him to make it work anyway." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. That silence had been the held-breath quiet of an audience watching a scandal unfold. This silence was a sharp, immediate quiet of an audience realizing the scandal had just been interrupted by evidence nobody had expected. Sterling recovered first, his voice sliding into the smooth, dismissive register a man used to erasing inconvenient interruptions. "I'm sorry," he said, glancing at Isaiah's uniform, at the small embroidered prestige event staffing logo on his lapel. "This is a member of the catering staff." "I don't think we need to entertain say his name again," Eleanor said. Everyone turned to look at her instead. She was staring at Isaiah with an intensity that made him understand, suddenly and completely, that this was the first genuine attention anyone at the head table had paid him all night, and that it mattered enormously. "What is your name?" she asked him directly. "Isaiah Reeves," he said. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "and you're telling this room, under your own name, in front of witnesses, that you personally overheard Foster Higgins instruct someone to falsify a medical document being used tonight to accuse me of cognitive incapacity." Isaiah's mouth was dry. He thought of the folder on the podium. He thought of Sterling's face, already rearranging itself into the careful shape of a man preparing to destroy whoever had just threatened him. He thought of his daughter asleep 2 hallways away, and of every month for the past 4 years that he had set aside $30 for a scholarship fund, because someone once did the same for him. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly what I'm telling you." For a long moment, nobody in the ballroom moved. Then Sterling laughed, a short, sharp sound meant to reset the temperature of the room. "This is absurd," he said. "We're going to take the word of a waiter over independent medical documentation, because he claims to have overheard something out of context near a service entrance. Foster, tell them this is ridiculous." Foster Higgins did not immediately answer. Isaiah watched his face carefully, the way he had learned to watch faces over 7 years of reading rooms for a living, and saw something shift there, something that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with a man doing rapid, panic math about how much this could cost him if the wrong person believed the wrong stranger. "It's ridiculous," Higgins said finally, but the words came out half a second too late and half a decibel too quiet, and in a room full of people trained by decades of business dealings to read exactly that kind of hesitation, several eyebrows rose at once. Eleanor did not look away from Isaiah. "Who was the man you overheard?" she asked him. "Can you describe him?" Isaiah described him carefully: the gray suit, the wire-rimmed glasses, the black leather bag he'd been carrying, the fact that he'd left through the service corridor toward the hotel's rear parking structure roughly 90 minutes ago. "There's a security camera covering that corridor," Eleanor said, still looking at Isaiah but speaking now to the room at large, her voice regaining the steadiness it had lost minutes earlier. "This hotel maintains footage for 30 days. I would like that footage pulled immediately, and I would like whoever commissioned this document to explain on camera exactly how it was produced." Sterling's face had gone the particular shade of pale that expensive tans cannot fully disguise. "This is completely unnecessary," he said. "We can resolve this privately. We are well past private." Eleanor said, "You made sure of that yourself, Bradford, when you decided a fundraising gala for sick children was the appropriate venue for your ambush." The event security director, a broad-shouldered man named Palmer, who had been standing near the ballroom entrance for the entire exchange with particular stillness of someone deciding whether this was his problem yet, finally stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said to Eleanor, "we can pull that footage right now if you'd like." "Please," Eleanor said. It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes in which nobody in that ballroom sat back down, in which 400 phones remained raised, in which Sterling stood near the podium rehearsing. Isaiah suspected every possible version of an explanation that might survive whatever the footage showed. Isaiah stood where he was too, not quite part of the head table's world, and no longer entirely part of the invisible service staff either, caught in the strange, suspended territory of a man who has just done something he cannot undo. When Palmer returned, he carried a tablet, and his expression had the particular grimness of a man who has seen something he wishes he had not. He handed the tablet to Eleanor without a word. She watched the footage in silence, her jaw tightening by degrees. Then she turned the tablet so that the nearest table could see the screen, and though most of the room could not make out the details from a distance, the local news photographer near the front certainly could. And so, notably, could the small cluster of reporters that every major gala in the city always attracted. The footage showed exactly what Isaiah had overheard: a man in a gray suit meeting Foster Higgins near the service corridor, a folder changing hands, a brief exchange of words that the camera did not have audio to capture, but that anyone watching the accompanying timestamp could see occurred at 7:14, nearly 90 minutes before Sterling stood up to make his accusations. "I'd like to introduce everyone to Dr. Aldous Meyer," Eleanor said, her voice carrying now with particular clarity of someone who has stopped being careful because she no longer needs to be. Dr. Meyer is not a member of my medical team. He has never treated me. He runs a small private consulting practice that, according to public records, I had my legal team review the moment Bradford's first email hinted at this ambush 3 days ago, has produced 11 similar assessments over the past 6 years, all commissioned by parties involved in hostile boardroom disputes, and none of which involved them ever actually examining the subject of the report. The room had gone from murmuring to something closer to a hell roar, the sound of 400 people simultaneously trying to process a scandal reorganizing itself in real time. Sterling attempted one more version of composure. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. "Foster may have handled the logistics of obtaining the review poorly, but the underlying concerns about Eleanor's fitness, Eleanor interrupted, "do not exist, Bradford. You built them tonight in this room, in front of donors who trusted this foundation with money meant for sick children, because you needed a public spectacle ugly enough that I couldn't simply outvote you at the next board meeting. You needed witnesses." "Well," she said, gesturing at the room, at the phones, at the reporters already typing furiously, "you have them." Isaiah stood very still through all of this, aware that it had just become, without intending to, one of the most visible people in a room full of the city's wealthiest residents, and entirely uncertain whether that visibility was about to end his career or simply his evening. It ended neither, not immediately. What happened instead was that Eleanor Vance turned her chair fully toward him, away from Sterling entirely, as though the man had already ceased to be the most important problem in the room, and looked at Isaiah with an expression he would spend the rest of that week trying to accurately describe to himself. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "I don't know anything about you beyond your name, and the fact that you just told the truth in a room where the truth was extremely inconvenient. I'd like to know more." Before Isaiah could answer, Sterling made his final mistake of the evening. Furious, cornered, and apparently unable to accept that a member of the catering staff had unraveled 4 months of careful planning, he turned toward Isaiah with the particular viciousness of a man who has run out of better targets. "You should be more careful," he said, his voice low but not low enough, "about which conversations you decide are your business. People like you don't get invited back to events like this." The room, which had already turned against Sterling in every meaningful sense, went colder still. Eleanor's voice cut through it like a blade drawn from its sheath. "People like him," she repeated, and let the phrase hang in the air long enough for every reporter in the room to finish writing it down. "Bradford, I think you should leave." Sterling opened his mouth to argue and then, apparently for the first time all evening, correctly read the room. He left. Higgins and Marsh followed a few minutes later, trailing behind him with the particular posture of people calculating exactly how much of tonight's disaster would attach itself permanently to their names. The gala did not end after that. Not exactly. Eleanor, with the composure of someone who had weathered worse storms than this one, returned to the podium, thanked the room for its patience, delivered a shortened version of her keynote about the year's research grants, and closed the evening with a promise that the Foundation's mission had not changed and would not change, regardless of who tried to make her doubt it in public. But everyone in that ballroom understood that the real story of the night had already happened, and that it involved a banquet server who had set down his tray and told the truth anyway. Isaiah found himself, 20 minutes later, sitting in a small side room off the main ballroom that Eleanor's assistant had quietly guided him toward, the kind of room hotels kept for exactly this purpose, private conversations that needed a door. Maya, roused gently from the staff lounge by Priya, sat beside him now, sleepy-eyed and clutching Professor tentacles, watching the strange, elegant woman in the wheelchair with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to hide it. Eleanor smiled at her. "Hello," she said. "I'm Eleanor. Your dad did something very brave tonight." Maya considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "Is that why everyone was staring at him?" "That's exactly why," Eleanor said. Maya turned to her father. "Are you in trouble?" Isaiah, who genuinely did not know the answer to that question yet, looked at Eleanor for it instead. Eleanor's expression softened into something Isaiah had not yet seen on her that night, something less armored. "No," she said to both of them. "He is not in trouble. Isaiah, I want to be direct with you, because I suspect you're the kind of man who prefers directness to flattery. What you did tonight took more courage than anything I've witnessed in a boardroom in 11 years of running this company, and I don't say that lightly." Isaiah shifted, uncomfortable in particular way people are uncomfortable receiving praise they did not do the thing to earn. "I just said what I heard," he said. "Anybody would have." Eleanor's expression softened into something Isaiah had not yet seen on her that night, something less armored. "No," she said to both of them. "He is not in trouble. Isaiah, I want to be direct with you, because I suspect you're the kind of man who prefers directness to flattery. What you did tonight took more courage than anything I've witnessed in a boardroom in 11 years of running this company, and I don't say that lightly." Isaiah shifted, uncomfortable in the particular way people are uncomfortable receiving praise they did not do the thing to earn. "I just said what I heard," he said. "Anybody would have." Eleanor's eyes, sharp and steady, held his. "That's not true, and you know it's not true," she said. "For 100 people heard the same warning signs I did tonight, watched the same performance, and every single one of them decided it was safer to stay quiet and watch. You were the only person in that room willing to risk something real to stop it. That's not ordinary, Isaiah. That's rare, and I built an entire career learning to recognize what's rare when I see it." Isaiah did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and Eleanor, seeming to understand that silence, did not push further, not yet. Instead, she asked about Maya's octopus book and about the reading program at Maya's school and about the community college business courses Isaiah mentioned almost by accident when Maya proudly informed her that her father, quote, "used to be really good at math before I was born." Eleanor listened to all of it with the focused attention of someone who had learned the hard way that the most important information about a person rarely arrived through their resume. Before they left the hotel that night, Eleanor pressed a card into Isaiah's hand, her own private number written on the back in blue ink. "Get some sleep," she told him. "Both of you. I'll call you Monday. I have a business proposition, and I'd like you to actually consider it before you say no out of politeness, which I suspect is exactly what you're planning to do right now." Isaiah laughed despite himself, surprised into it. She was not wrong. That night, driving home with Maya asleep against a window and Professor Tentacles wedged carefully between them, Isaiah replayed the evening over and over, the folder, the footage, Sterling's face collapsing in real time, and Eleanor's voice cutting through the room like something forged rather than spoken. He did not know yet what Monday would bring. He only knew that for the first time and longer than he could easily remember, he had done something entirely because it was right, with no guarantee it would cost him anything less than everything, and it had not cost him what he feared. It had, instead, opened a door he had not known was there. He carried Maya inside, tucked her into bed with Professor Tentacles propped against her pillow exactly where she liked it, and stood in her doorway for a long moment listening to her breathe. "Daddy," she mumbled, half asleep already. "You were really brave tonight." "I don't know about that, kiddo," he said quietly. Maya, eyes already closed, smiled a particular smile of a child who has decided something is simply true and does not require further discussion. "I do," she said, and was asleep before he could answer. Monday arrived colder than the weekend had promised, the first real bite of autumn settling over the city. Isaiah had spent the 2 days between the Gala and Eleanor's call telling himself, with decreasing conviction each time, that nothing would actually come of it. Wealthy people said things like, "I'll call you Monday," out of the same reflexive generosity that made them tip extravagantly after a few glasses of champagne. Promises made in a warm room that rarely survived contact with a cold Tuesday morning. He was wrong. Eleanor called at 9 sharp, her voice as crisp and businesslike as it had been commanding 2 nights earlier, and asked him to come to the Vance Analytics headquarters that afternoon. Not for an interview, she clarified when he asked, uncertain what to prepare for a conversation. The headquarters occupied the top 11 floors of a glass tower downtown, the kind of building whose lobby had its own waterfall and whose elevators required a badge Isaiah did not have. So a young assistant met him at the security desk and walked him up personally, chatting easily about nothing in particular in the way people do when they've been specifically instructed to make a guest feel comfortable. Eleanor's office occupied the northeast corner of the top floor, floor-to-ceiling windows on two sides. The desk arranged at a height that allowed her to work comfortably from her chair, every fixture in the room quietly, deliberately accessible in ways Isaiah would not have consciously noticed if he had not spent the last 2 days thinking about exactly the kind of world that was built without people like her in mind, and exactly the kind of person who had decided to build something different instead. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing him toward a low seating area near the window rather than the imposing desk, a choice Isaiah suspected was deliberate. This needed to be a conversation between equals, not a summons. Isaiah sat, still faintly disoriented by the scale of everything around him. "I wasn't sure what to expect," he admitted. "Neither was I, entirely," Eleanor said, which surprised him. "But I've spent the last 2 days having my head of security run a background check on you. Thorough, respectful, but thorough. I hope that doesn't feel invasive. I find it's the only responsible way to make the kind of offer I'm about to make." Isaiah's stomach tightened slightly. "What did you find?" Eleanor smiled, and it reached her eyes this time. "I found a man who worked banquet service 4 or 5 nights a week for 7 years while raising a daughter alone, who has never once been late for a shift, who is remembered by every event manager he's worked under as someone who trains new staff without being asked to and never takes credit for it. I found 2 semesters of business coursework with a transcript full of marks that made your former professor, whom I called personally, ask me why on earth you weren't running a company by now. And I found," she said, watching his face carefully, "a standing monthly donation, $30, to a scholarship fund at that same community college, going back 4 years without a single missed month." Isaiah felt something tighten in his throat. "That's not exactly public information," he said. "Quiet." "It isn't," Eleanor agreed, "which is exactly why it matters. Anyone can perform generosity when they know people are watching, Isaiah. Almost nobody keeps doing it quietly for years when there's no possible audience. That tells me more about a person's character than any interview I've ever conducted." She leaned forward slightly. "I want to offer you a position," she said. "Not a courtesy job, not a thank you gesture, though I am deeply grateful for what you did Friday night. A real position. Vance Analytics is opening a new logistics operations division, and I need someone to run community outreach and workforce partnerships, someone who understands firsthand what actually costs an ordinary working person to build a life, while institutions make almost no accommodation for them. I need someone who reads a room the way you read that ballroom, who notices a thing everyone else is too comfortable to notice. I think that's you." Isaiah sat very still, absorbing the scale of what she was actually offering. What would that mean practically, he asked carefully, aware of exactly how much he did not know about corporate structures, about salary ranges at companies worth billions of dollars, about whether this was a kind of offer that came with strings he could not yet see. Eleanor answered without hesitation, sliding a folder across the low table between them, considerably thinner than the one Foster Higgins had produced 2 nights earlier, and considerably more honest. "A starting salary that would triple what you currently earn. Full benefits, including education assistance, should you want to finish that business degree, which, frankly, I think you should. Flexible scheduling built around Maya's school hours, non-negotiable. Because I built this company's culture around exactly that principle after my accident taught me how little grace the working world extends to people who need it structured differently. And a 5-year contract with clear performance benchmarks, reviewed by an actual employment attorney of your choosing before you sign anything. Because I don't want your trust. I want your informed consent." Isaiah opened the folder, scanned the number at the top, and had to read it twice before it settled into something he could fully process. "This is because of Friday night," he said finally, need to say it aloud to test whether it was true. "It's because of what Friday night revealed," Eleanor corrected. "Not because you defended me, Though I won't pretend that didn't matter to me personally, because of what it told me about who you are underneath 7 years of a job that never once let you use half of what you're actually capable of. I've spent 11 years building a company on the principle that talent doesn't announce itself with a diploma or a title. It announces itself in moments like Friday, when everything is on the line, and a person chooses truth anyway. I'm not offering you charity, Isaiah. I'm offering you a role I genuinely believe you're better suited for than half the people currently occupying similar positions with considerably more expensive educations. Isaiah closed the folder slowly. His mind ran unbidden to Maya, asleep 2 nights ago with Professor Tentacles tucked under her chin, to the reading program fee he had budgeted around for months, to the $30 he sent every month without fail to a scholarship fund, because somebody once did the same for him, and to particular, quiet fear that had lived in his chest for 7 years, the fear that no matter how hard he worked, the life he could build for his daughter would always be built from scraps. I need to think about it, he said, because it felt important to say honestly rather than accept out of sheer disbelief. Of course, Eleanor said. Take the week. Talk to Maya. If you think that's right for your family, talk to a lawyer. I'd be suspicious of you if you said yes on the spot. He left her office that afternoon holding a folder that represented on paper the exact shape of the life he had once imagined for himself before circumstances rearranged every plan he had ever made, and he drove home slowly, replaying the conversation, testing it from every angle for the catch he could not quite believe was not there. That evening, he told Maya the basic shape of it, carefully, the way he told her most complicated things, in language she could hold on to without being overwhelmed by details that were not hers to carry. Miss Eleanor wanted me to come work for her company, he said. It would mean a lot of things would change. New job, more money, maybe eventually a different school, if we wanted that someday. Maya considered this with her characteristic seriousness, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor with Professor Tentacles in her lap. Would you still pick me up from school? She asked, which Isaiah understood immediately was the only question that actually mattered to her. I'd make sure of it, he said. That's part of the deal. Non-negotiable, he added, borrowing Eleanor's word because it felt like the right one. Will we still live here? For now, he said. Maybe not forever. But we'd decide that together whenever it happened. Nothing changes overnight. Maya nodded slowly, processing, and then asked a question that made Isaiah's chest ache with something between pride and grief for every year he had spent worrying alone about exactly this kind of decision. Do you want to do it? She asked. Not what should you do. What do you want? Isaiah looked at his daughter, 7 years old, missing her front teeth, entirely unaware of how rare it was for a child that age to ask her father what he wanted instead of simply what would happen to her, and felt something in his chest loosen that had been tight for longer than he could remember. Yeah, he said, surprising himself with how certain it sounded once it was actually spoken aloud. I think I do. He called Eleanor 2 days later, after a consultation with an employment attorney a friend from the agency recommended, a woman named Deborah, who read every line of the contract twice and told him, bluntly, that she had reviewed executive offers with worse terms and considerably more suspicious motives behind them. The contract, she said, was exactly what it appeared to be. Fair, generous, unusually so, but not in a way that suggested any hidden obligation. Isaiah signed on a Thursday afternoon in Eleanor's office, with Deborah present and Maya, who had insisted on coming, sitting in the low chair by the window, drawing a picture of an octopus wearing what appeared to be a tiny business suit. Welcome to Vance Analytics, Eleanor said, shaking his hand with a particular firmness of someone who meant every word of the sentence rather than treating it as a formality. The transition was not effortless, and Isaiah had not expected it to be. His first weeks were an education in an entirely different language, one built from acronyms and org charts and quarterly review cycles he had never needed to understand from the far side of a banquet tray. He studied at night after Maya went to bed, the way he had once studied for the business courses he never finished, and found, to his quiet relief, that the sharpness his old professor had once praised had not actually gone anywhere. It had simply been waiting for a use. Eleanor checked in with him personally at first, more than his actual supervisor did. Not out of doubt of his ability, but out of the particular investment of someone watching a decision she had made with total conviction begin to prove itself correct. She introduced him to department heads with a directness that left no room for the quiet condescension Isaiah had half expected, the kind of soft skepticism people extend to someone whose resume does not match the room they have suddenly entered. Not everyone at Advanced Analytics welcomed him warmly. A mid-level director named Preston Okafor, who had spent 6 years angling for exactly the kind of visibility Isaiah's new role commanded, made his displeasure known in small, deniable ways, excluding Isaiah from meeting invitations that should have included him, routing information a day late. The particular petty sabotage of a man who could not openly object to Eleanor's decision, but had no intention of making it easy either. Isaiah recognized the pattern immediately, having spent 7 years reading rooms for a living, and made the deliberate choice not to escalate it. Not yet. Instead, he did the thing he had always done best. He worked. He learned the names of everyone on his team within the first 2 weeks, remembered which contractors had kids and which had ailing parents, and built, brick by brick, exactly the kind of quiet credibility that eventually made the pettiness look less like caution and more like what it actually was. 3 months into the role, Isaiah's division launched its first major initiative, a workforce partnership with 2 community colleges, including the one where he had once studied and never finished, offering paid internships to students balancing coursework with the exact kind of financial precarity he understood better than any consultant Advanced Analytics could have hired. The program filled its first cohort within 2 weeks, an unusually fast turnaround that even Eleanor's most skeptical board members noted with surprise. In the quarterly review, Sterling, Higgins, and Marsh had all resigned from the board within a month of the gala, their positions no longer tenable once the security footage and Dr. Meyer's history became public record. First through reporters who had been in that ballroom, and then through an internal investigation Eleanor's legal team conducted with the same thoroughness she brought to every threat against her company. Sterling's connection to Larchmont Capital, exactly as Eleanor had suspected, unraveled into a minor scandal of its own, one that ended up standing on 2 other corporate boards within the year. Isaiah did not think about Sterling often after that, not out of forgiveness exactly, but because there was simply too much else worth thinking about instead. But Bradford Sterling, it turned out, was not a man who disappeared quietly, and the trouble he left behind did not end the night he walked out of that ballroom. 6 weeks into Isaiah's new role, an anonymous account began posting in a private online forum used by mid-level executives across the city's business community, a forum Isaiah had never heard until Eleanor's head of communications forwarded him a screenshot with the subject line, "We need to talk." The posts were careful, deniable, the kind of thing that could never be traced to a single author with certainty, but the pattern was unmistakable to anyone who had stood in that ballroom 6 weeks earlier. Interesting that Advanced Analytics promoted a banquet server into a VP track role overnight. One post read, "Wonder what qualifications actually matter there anymore, or if loyalty is the only requirement now." Another, days later, referenced the Workforce Partnership Program by name, questioning whether taxpayer-adjacent grant money, funded in part through a public-private partnership with the community colleges, was being properly administered by someone with, as the post phrased it, no formal training and program oversight. None of it was technically false. That was what made it effective. Isaiah did not have formal training and program oversight, not on paper. Not yet. He had a partial business degree and 7 years of reading rooms for a living and 4 months of intensive, unglamorous work learning everything Advanced Analytics could teach him, and none of that translated cleanly into the kind of credential the post implied he lacked. Isaiah found out about the post on a Tuesday from Preston Okafor, of all people, who slid his laptop across the conference table during a routine strategy meeting with an expression that was trying very hard to look neutral and mostly succeeding. "Thought you should see this before it spreads further," Okafor said, and Isaiah could not immediately tell whether the gesture was decency or strategy, whether Okafor wanted him informed or simply wanted to watch his reaction. Isaiah read the post twice. feeling the old, familiar tightening in his chest that he recognized from 7 years of being underestimated in rooms that assumed the worst of him before he opened his mouth. He thought of Maya, of the new school, of the reading program he now quietly funded, of every plan that had finally started to feel solid instead of provisional, and felt, for one cold moment, the specific fear of a man who has finally built something and is watching helplessly as someone tries to take it apart with nothing but implication and doubt. He did not go to Eleanor immediately. He told himself it was because he did not want to seem like he needed rescuing again, that the whole point of the last 4 months had been proving he belonged in that building on his own merits, not on the strength of one dramatic night at a gala. He spent 2 days quietly investigating instead the same patient, careful attention he had once brought to reading a ballroom, applied now to reading an organization. What he found by the end of the second day was that the anonymous forum account had been created using an email address that traced through a chain of subsidiary registrations Isaiah had learned to follow during his crash course in corporate structure, back to a small consulting firm that had, until recently, listed Foster Higgins as a minority partner. Isaiah sat with that information for an entire evening before deciding what to do with it, Maya doing homework at the kitchen table beside him, occasionally glancing up to ask why his face looked so serious. He told her it was just a work puzzle, which was not entirely a lie. The following morning, he brought everything to Eleanor directly, laying out the trail the same methodical way he had once laid out, to a stunned ballroom, the timeline of a folder and a hallway conversation. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her expression darkening by degrees as the picture assembled itself. "I could have brought this to you the moment I found the first post," Isaiah said. When he finished, "I didn't. I wanted to be sure I could stand behind it completely before I asked you to act on it, because I know exactly what it looks like if I'm wrong about something like this." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, studying him. "That instinct is exactly why I promoted you as fast as I did," she said finally. "But I want you to hear this clearly, Isaiah. You do not have to build an entire case alone before you're allowed to ask for help. That's not strength. That's a habit built by years of being in rooms where nobody would have helped you even if you'd asked. This is not one of those rooms." Isaiah absorbed that slowly, aware how deeply the old habit ran. The habit of solving every problem alone before anyone else even noticed it existed. A habit built by 7 years of raising a daughter with no safety net beneath either of them. Eleanor's legal team moved quickly once the trail was confirmed. And within a week, a cease and desist letter, followed by the quiet, unglamorous threat of a defamation suit, ended the anonymous post entirely. Higgins, already reeling from his resignation and the unraveling of his other board positions, did not fight it. The forum account went dark and no formal charges were filed, a decision Eleanor made deliberately. "I could bury him in litigation," she told Isaiah afterward, standing at her office window, looking out over the city. "It would feel good for about a week. But the smarter move is letting people see exactly what happened and draw their own conclusions. Public embarrassment lasts longer than any lawsuit, and it costs us nothing to let it." Isaiah understood the wisdom in that, though a part of him, the part that still remembered the specific vertigo of watching strangers question whether he deserved the life he was building, wanted something closer to consequence than silence. He did not say so. He had learned in 4 months that Eleanor's instinct about long games were rarely wrong. The episode left its mark anyway, in smaller ways. For the first time since accepting the position, Isaiah found himself lying awake some nights running through every conversation of the day, wondering which of his colleagues had read those posts and quietly agreed with them, wondering whether the promotion Eleanor had begun discussing privately would now seem, to anyone watching, like proof of exactly the favoritism the post had implied. He mentioned this once, carefully, to Vernon Ashby, the head of the workforce program's teaching partnership at the community college, a man in his 60s who had spent 30 years watching bright students from difficult circumstances doubt themselves out of opportunities they had more than earned. Vernon listened, nodding slowly, and then told Isaiah something that stayed with him longer than almost anything else that year. "The people who whisper about whether you belong somewhere," Vernon said, "are almost never the people who actually have to work alongside you every day and watch what you do with a chance." They're the people standing far enough away that they never have to test their own theory against the evidence. Let the evidence keep speaking for you, son. It always does. Eventually, if you keep showing up. Isaiah kept showing up. The second cohort of the workforce partnership launched on schedule, larger than the first. With an unexpected addition, Isaiah had fought for personally, a small stipend fund to participants with children, modeled directly on every calculation he had once made himself about which $40 expenses he could and could not absorb in a given month. Enrollment exceeded projections by nearly a third. It was during the rollout of that second cohort, for months after the anonymous posts had gone quiet, that Isaiah faced a test that would matter far more than any forum comment ever could. A 19-year-old participant named Devontae Marsh, no relation to the departed board member, had been thriving in the program for 6 weeks, balancing a full course load with a paid internship in the logistics division. When his supervisor flagged a discrepancy in an inventory reconciliation report Devontae had prepared, the numbers did not match, a gap of several $1,000s in tracked equipment that the automated system attributed to an access code registered under Devontae's employee credentials. The supervisor, a longtime employee named Rosalind Kemp, who had never fully warmed to the workforce program and had said as much quietly in more than one meeting, brought the discrepancy directly to senior leadership rather than to Isaiah first, framing it, deliberately or not, as exactly the kind of risk she had warned about when the program launched, bringing people in without proper vetting. She said in the meeting Isaiah was eventually invited into, well after concern had already circulated up 2 levels above him. This is what happens. Isaiah sat in that meeting and felt something close to déjà vu, the particular vertigo of watching an institution move quickly toward the easiest, most convenient explanation for a problem, the explanation that required no one to examine their own assumptions. He thought of Devontae, a serious, soft-spoken young man who had told Isaiah, during their first one-on-one conversation, that he was the first person in his family to hold any job that came with badge in an office, and that he intended to prove his mother right for believing in him. "I'd like 48 hours before anyone takes action," Isaiah said, and the room, several rungs above his official pay grade and seniority, looked at him with the particular skepticism that followed him, in smaller doses, since the day he arrived. He got his 48 hours, though not without Rosalind Kemp making it clear she considered the request a personal courtesy rather than professional necessity. Isaiah spent those 2 days doing exactly what he had done in that barroom 8 months earlier, paying close attention to details other people found it more convenient to ignore. He pulled the full access logs himself, cross-referencing timestamps against Devontae's actual class and internship schedule, and found, buried in a column nobody had thought to examine closely, that the discrepancy had occurred during a 2-hour window when Devontae's student badge showed him sitting in a lecture hall 3 miles away, a fact the automated inventory system had no way of knowing because it tracked only the digital credential, which it turned out had been used simultaneously at a second terminal inside the warehouse. The second terminal belonged to a contractor named Wes Halloran, a temporary logistics worker who had, Isaiah discovered after another day of careful, quiet inquiry, borrowed Devontae's still active badge from an unlocked equipment locker to bypass his own expired temporary access rather than wait for IT to reissue it, a shortcut he had taken more than once, apparently without realizing or particularly caring whose name it would attach itself to if anything ever went wrong. Isaiah brought the full timeline back to the same room that had been prepared 48 hours earlier to quietly end a 19-year-old's internship over mistake he had not made. He laid it out with the same unhurried clarity Eleanor had once used to dismantle a fabricated medical report in front of 400 witnesses, and watched Rosalind Kemp's expression shift from certainty to something considerably less comfortable. Devontae kept his internship. Wes Halloran did not, and the equipment locker policy that had allowed an unattended badge to be borrowed in the first place was rewritten within the week. Isaiah made a point of telling Devontae the outcome in person, rather than through an email from HR, sitting with him in the small conference room his own division still used, and watching relief move across the young man's face in real time. "I almost believed it was my fault," Devontae admitted quietly. Everybody in that meeting looked so sure. Isaiah thought himself. 7 years earlier, being looked at with exactly that same certainty by people who had already decided, long before any evidence existed, what conclusion they intended to reach. Being sure doesn't make people right. He told Devontae, it just makes them loud. The truth doesn't care how loud the room is. It only needs someone patient enough to find it. That evening, Eleanor stopped by Isaiah's office before he left for the day, having heard the full story from 3 different directions by the time it reached her. You didn't have to fight that battle personally, she said. You could have let HR handle it and stayed out of it entirely. Nobody would have faulted you for that. I know, Isaiah said, but I remember exactly what it feels like to be the person everyone's already decided the truth about before they bother to check. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. That's precisely why this division exists, she said finally, and precisely why it needed you specifically running it, rather than anyone else I interviewed for the role before that gala ever happened. She paused at the doorway. I almost hired someone else, before Friday. A candidate with considerably more traditional credentials. Isaiah had not known that, and something in him went very still hearing it. What changed your mind? Eleanor's smile was small, but genuine. Nothing changed my mind, she said. You did. I just hadn't met you yet. On a Friday evening nearly 6 months after the gala, Isaiah stood in the small conference room his division had claimed as its own, reviewing enrollment numbers for the second cohort of the Workforce Partnership, when Eleanor rolled in unannounced, a folder of her own tucked against her lap. You should see these numbers, he said, turning his laptop toward her. I already have, she said. I read every report from your division before anyone else's. Old habit. She set her folder down. I wanted to tell you something in person, rather than let you read it in a memo. Isaiah waited. The board approved your promotion to vice president this morning, she said. Full autonomy over workforce development strategy company-wide, a seat at the quarterly strategy sessions, and a considerable increase to match, effective next month. Isaiah sat back slowly, the numbers settling into place the way the first offer had. Disbelief giving way, more quickly this time, to something steadier. I don't know what to say, he admitted. You don't have to say anything, Eleanor said. You've already said it every day for 6 months, in the way you do this work. She paused. I want you to know something else. 2. That night at the gala. The thing that told me you were the right person for that first offer. It wasn't only that you told the truth in front of 400 people. It was that you did it knowing exactly how much it might cost you, with a child asleep 2 hallways away who depended entirely on you not losing that job. Most people calculate that risk and decide silence is safer. You didn't, and I've learned the hard way that people who choose integrity when it's expensive are worth building an entire company culture around. Isaiah thought of Sterling's voice in that ballroom. People like you don't get invited back to events like this, and of everything that had unfolded in the months since, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, that the particular shape of his life had finally stopped being something he merely endured and had become something he was genuinely, deliberately building. That evening, he picked Maya up from her after-school program, now held at a different school entirely, one with a science curriculum she had been quietly wishing for since she was 5 years old and first became convinced octopuses were the smartest animals on Earth. She ran to the car the way she always did, backpack bouncing. Professor Tentacles, considerably more threadbare now, but still present in her bag every single day, tucked under one arm. How was work? She asked, climbing into back seat with the easy confidence of a child who no longer needed to ask nervous questions about school changes or moving vans, because those questions had all, gently and honestly, been answered months ago. Really good. Actually, Isaiah said, catching her eye in the rearview mirror. I got a promotion today. Maya's whole face lit up. Does that mean more money for the reading program? Isaiah laughed. The particular laugh of a man who remembered exactly how carefully he had once budgeted around $40 a semester, and who now funded that entire program quietly, without attaching his name to it. A fact Maya did not yet know and would not learn until she was considerably older, old enough to understand why a person might choose to help without ever wanting the credit for it. 2 weeks after promotion, the community college that had once let a broke single father attend night classes between shifts held its annual scholarship banquet, a modest affair compared to the grand Whitmore Gala. Folding tables instead of chandeliers, sheet cake instead of raw bar, but no less meaningful to the people gathered in that gymnasium. Isaiah had been invited as a guest speaker, a request that had made him genuinely nervous in a way that surprised him, given everything he had already stood through that year. He brought Maya, who wore her favorite dress and insisted on carrying Professor Tentacles despite Isaiah's gentle suggestion that a stuffed octopus might be unusual company at a formal event. Eleanor came as well, not because Isaiah had asked her to, but because she had heard about the invitation and asked with unusual hesitation for a woman who rarely hesitated about anything, whether it would be appropriate for her to attend quietly, without fanfare, simply see the place that had shaped someone she had come to respect enormously. Isaiah stood at a podium far smaller than the one Bradford Sterling had once used to try to destroy a woman's reputation in front of 400 witnesses, and looked out at perhaps 60 students, most of them working adults balancing classes with jobs and children, and particular exhaustion of building a life from scraps, and found that the words came more easily than he had expected. I sat where you're sitting, he told them, 8 years ago, 2 semesters from a degree I never finished, because life asked me to choose between finishing something for myself and showing up completely for someone who needed me more. I want you to know that choice was not a failure. It felt like one for a long time. It was not. Whatever this program gave me, the chance to study it all, alongside a full-time job and a toddler at home, it planted something that did not die just because I couldn't water it for a few years. It was still there when I finally had the chance to come back to it. Some of you are going to have to step away from this, maybe more than once, for reasons that have nothing to do with how capable you are. When that happens, I want you to remember that stepping away is not the same as giving up. The only real failure is deciding the thing you set aside was never worth returning to. He talked for 12 minutes, no notes, the way it once described a folder in a hallway conversation to a stunned ballroom. And when he finished, Vernon Ashby, sitting in the front row, was openly wiping his eyes, unashamed, the way men who have spent 30 years watching students disappear for reasons beyond their control are allowed to be unashamed when one of them finally, publicly, comes all the way back. Afterward, in the gymnasium's small reception area, Eleanor found Isaiah near the folding table with the sheet cake, watching Maya explain octopus camouflage to a bewildered but polite graduate student. "This is the room," Eleanor said quietly. "That made you." "This is one of the rooms," Isaiah said. "My father made the rest of it. And Renee," before she passed. "And Maya, honestly, more than anybody. Kids have a way of teaching you who you actually are, whether you're ready for the lesson or not." Eleanor watched Maya a moment longer, the girl now demonstrating, with theatrical seriousness, exactly how an octopus could squeeze through a gap the size of its own eyeball, narrating the fact to an audience of 3 adults who had absolutely nothing better to do than listen. "I never had children," Eleanor said, after a moment, her voice softer than Isaiah had ever heard it in the office. "There was never room building the company. And then after the accident, there was even less room, or so I told myself. Watching you with her these past months, I wondered sometimes whether I told myself that so I wouldn't have to feel what I'm feeling right now. Watching someone build the exact kind of life I always assumed my choices had made impossible for me." Isaiah did not have a tidy answer for that, and he did not try to invent one. "It's not too late for whatever version of that you actually want," he said instead. "I learned that the hard way, too. The life you think got taken from you sometimes comes back looking completely different than you expected. Mine did." Eleanor smiled, small and real, and said nothing further, but Isaiah noticed, in the months that followed, that she began arriving occasionally to the Foundation's smaller community events, the ones far less photographed in the annual gala, the school visits and the tutoring program launches, and the quiet afternoons handing out backpacks before the start of a new year, events that had nothing to do with donors or headlines, and everything to do with the exact kind of unglamorous patient work that had once made a banquet server set down his tray because he could not stand to watch injustice happen quietly in a room full of people too comfortable to interrupt it. A year to the day after the gala, the Vance Foundation held its next annual fundraiser in the same ballroom, under the same chandeliers. Though Isaiah noticed, walking in this time in a suit that belonged to him rather than a rented uniform, that the room felt entirely different than it had the year before, not because the room had changed, but because he had. Eleanor opened the evening not with keynote about grants, but with a story, one she had cleared with Isaiah beforehand, about a member of the catering staff who had once set down a tray of champagne and told the truth in front of 400 people who had every reason to expect him to stay silent. She did not use his name during the story, respecting, as she always had, his preference to let his work speak rather than his history. But when she finished, she gestured toward the back of the room, where Isaiah stood near the doors exactly where he had stood a year earlier, and the applause that followed lasted considerably longer than either of them had expected. Maya, seated at a small table near the front with a babysitter Eleanor had personally vetted, stood on her chair to see better, clapping with both hands over her head, Professor Tentacles tucked under one arm, entirely unbothered by the fact that half the room was now looking in her direction, too. Later that night, driving home with Maya dozing against a window, the city lights sliding past in long amber streaks, Isaiah thought about his father, about 30 years of quiet, uncomplained about work in hospital corridors, about a single sentence that had traveled farther than either of them could have guessed. You don't have to be loud to be right. You only have to still be standing there when everybody else finally figures out you were right the whole time. He glanced at his daughter in the rearview mirror, Professor Tentacles slipping slightly from her loosening grip, and reached back without looking, tucked the stuffed octopus more securely against her side, a small, automatic gesture built from thousands of repetitions over 7 years of exactly this kind of quiet, unwatched care. "Daddy," Maya mumbled, half asleep, "is Miss Eleanor going to be at Thanksgiving this year?" "If she wants to be, kiddo," Isaiah said softly. "I think our table's got room." Maya smiled, eyes still closed, and said nothing further, drifting the rest of the way home in a particular, unguarded piece of a child who has never once had to wonder whether the world will hold her, because her father had spent every single day of her life quietly proving that it would. Isaiah laughed, the particular laugh of a man who remembered exactly how carefully he had once budgeted around $40 a semester, and who now quietly, without any fanfare, funded that same program for every student in Maya's grade who could not otherwise afford it, a gesture he had made privately through the school, unattached to his name, because some habits, it turned out, did not change no matter how much the rest of his life did. "It means a lot of good things, kiddo," he said. Maya considered this with her usual gravity, then asked, as she often did lately, the question that had become something like a small ritual between them since that night at the gala. "Are you glad you said something? At the party, I mean, when the mean man was being mean to Miss Eleanor." Isaiah thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about everything she asked him. He thought about the tray he had set down, about the 4 words that had felt in the moment like the most dangerous thing he had ever said out loud, about the 7 years before that moment spent believing that men like him did not get to change the shape of rooms like that one. "Yeah," he said, "I think that might be the best thing I ever did, next to being your dad." Maya beamed, satisfied, and returned her attention to Professor Tentacles, adjusting one of his felt eyes that had come slightly loose, entirely unaware that she had just received, in the most ordinary tone imaginable, the most important lesson her father would ever teach her, delivered the way the truest things usually are, quietly, in a car, on an unremarkable Friday afternoon, long after the ballroom lights had gone dark, and the only witnesses left to it were the 2 people who had walked out of that night and built something real from what could have so easily been forgotten by morning. Somewhere behind them, in a glass tower downtown, a company kept growing under the leadership of a woman who had refused to let a wheelchair or a boardroom full of cowards define the limits of what she could build. And somewhere in the quiet architecture of that company, A division kept expanding under the leadership of a man who had once carried trays through ballrooms for a living, and who now spent his days making sure that the next person standing at the edge of a room, watching an injustice unfold and wondering if speaking up was worth the risk, would find, waiting for them, exactly the kind of chance nobody had ever promised him, but that it earned anyway, one quiet, unwatched act of integrity. At a time, goodness, it turned out, had never actually been invisible. It had simply been waiting, patiently, for someone powerful enough to notice and honest enough to act on what she saw.